My name is David Johns, and this is a word about inviting in. For us, the idea of inviting in people means that once you do the work required to demonstrate that you are competent and compassionate, I can share with you, or we can share with you, parts of who we are, including who we love, or other things that you might need to know about our identity.
Who people marry, who people love, is their business.
James Baldwin once famously said, "If I love you, I have to make you conscious of what you don't see." And to me, that quote embodies the spirit of inviting in.
Representation in this regard is incredibly important. One of the reasons why we decided to claim James Baldwin's birthday as Inviting In Day is that he remained unapologetic in talking about and inviting us into so many parts of what made him a whole person. And often there are still too many of us, Black, LGBTQIA+, and same-gender loving people who don't have access to windows and mirrors, representations of parts of us, and you show up in the world to offer windows and mirrors.
When you first told me about the concept of inviting in, it just went, but also just made so much sense. Because in a way, I feel like it was a double entendre for me to do videos in my closet, because I was trying to show my fashion, but also literally inviting people into my closet to help them with the coming out. So it's almost like, hey, I was inviting in a way, but without saying it. It is crazy that we have to come out and nobody else does, right? So I feel like the idea of inviting in is just even more respectful, but also it's welcoming, it's endearing. It makes me feel like the idea of home and safety, and also family, whether that's chosen family or real family. That's how I feel about the concept of inviting in instead of having to push people out, because that scares a lot of people. It is frightening, especially feeling like you have to do it because you stand out, or that you're different from the other people, or being pushed because somebody wants to out you, different things like that could cause trauma for people.
When I do invite you into my life, I expect you to do the same. I expect you to go an extra mile and learn more about, my identity, and help me not, judge myself, and not to feel like I'm not in a safe environment.
Love is where you find it. And you don't know where it will carry you. And it is a terrifying thing, love. It is the only human possibility, but it's terrifying. And a man can fall in love with a man, a woman can fall in love with a woman. There's nothing anybody can do about it.
Inviting in, to me, is such a self-empowering word. It's a word that says, in spite of the fact that you think you ought to be entitled to this information about me, this very private and personal information about me, I still get to decide. There's a level of autonomy. It's kind of one of the reasons why I don't like the idea of coming out, almost as if to suggest that you haven't been present before. Sexuality is a part of who we are. It isn't all of who we are. No, I didn't invite in. Originally, I didn't come out either. The circumstances and situation allow people to draw their own conclusions even before I could say what was true and what was real for me. There was a piece of violence done to me. Inviting in is very, very important, because while I could not control a lot, I could control that much. And when I decided that an invitation in was something I wanted to do, I shared it liberally on national television. Prior to that, however, I shared it very, very intimately and very close-knit amongst a very small number of people, my wife being one of those persons. But I embrace the term wholeheartedly of inviting in. It gives me, the individual, the power.
James Baldwin wrote about homosexuality as a noun and as a verb, as something that people do versus something that defines a person. Given the larger preoccupation with how LGBTQIA people show up in the world, show up in relationships and in love, what can we learn from Baldwin's worldview?
He never, ever walked the earth, certainly in the period that we were able to observe him, believing that he owed anything to anyone outside himself for who he was. his words, unfortunately, David, remain as relevant today as the day that he put pen to paper. And to me, that's a pretty sad indictment.
We have to be strong enough to let people be free to live, no? Do you think you have the right, or I have the right to tell anybody else who or he or she should marry, who he or she should love? That will weaken the fiber of the nation faster than anything else.
Inviting someone to be in partnership with me, to invite them into conversations about my politic, my worldview, and the role I want to play as we think about reimagining what's possible here.
When I think about coming out, I think about telling somebody my secret. And being trans is not a secret of mine. Being trans is a point of pride for me. Being trans is something that is so beautiful and that I'm happy to be. Instead, I invite in, and I invite in ways that are not necessarily, hey, David, I'm trans and I wanted to invite you into my experience. But I invite in by making posts on my Instagram. I speak about my transness in an everyday context. And to me, that is inviting in.
James Baldwin, Uncle Jimmy, is quoted as saying in 1984, 2 years after the best year ever, in the Village Voice in New York, that the sexual question and the racial question have always been entwined, If Americans can mature on the level of racism, then they have to mature on the level of sexuality. How are Black people generally impacted by LGBTQIA+ phobia and bias against Black folks who are members and have always been members of our beautifully diverse community?
Black trans women have been on the forefronts of every single civil rights and human rights movement. Black trans women have always been in the streets. Black trans women have always been trying to get into the rooms that we now see ourselves in more than we were ever able to be before. We've always been fighting for all of our siblings to be free, because we've understood that our freedom is not valid unless all of us are free.
What's the solution? What's the labor that we should be inviting Black folks who purport to care about other Black folks to engage in?
Education and making the resources readily available to our siblings. Queerness existed far before any idea of whiteness or Westernism was ever introduced into our existence and our living. Homophobia and transphobia, like racism, are tools of white supremacy, and that they have been utilized to turn us against our own communities and our own siblings and make us complicit to an extent, because I think that's a really important piece of language to contextualize, complicit to an extent in the destruction of our own communities.
When you think about the ideal community or society or world for Black, LGBTQIA+, angel-loving people, what does it look like?
The ideal world for me, for Black queer people specifically, is being able to wake up every morning and not questioning whether you'll return home safe and sound to a bed that is there, to a family that loves you, and in a house that you'll never have to worry about being insecure. So I hope for a day when my safety is not a privilege, but a right, and that I am given everything I need in order to just simply thrive and exist.
I don't think that we've come this far to fall into the European nightmare. That's exactly how the European nightmare began, by dictating to other people how they should live. We haven't got the right to do that.
I think about the ways in which I invite people in. It is by being open, being honest, living with integrity as a queer person. I also love to teach about queer identity, specifically coming from the perspective of a Black woman.
Determine who you are and decide whether you want to invite people in or not. That is up to you. That is the agency, the power, and the energy that you must have.